Now, programming from the Illinois Channel, an independent, nonpartisan corporation formed to provide nonpartisan coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois. For more information on the Illinois Channel, please visit our website at www.illinoischannel.org.
Just ahead, State Senator Andy Manar speaks at a luncheon hosted by the State University's Annuitants Association and talks about the budget impasse from the perspective of Senate Democrats. Then in about 35 minutes from now, State Senator Jason Barreckman holds a press conference to discuss the aspects of his legislation, Senate Bill 1124, which would reform the state's school funding formula. Following that, in about 1 hour and 15 minutes, we attend a press conference in which Democrat State Senators Heather Stearns and Toy Hutchinson call on the House to revisit SB 9, a budget bill which passed the Senate, and work to negotiate on certain measures so a revenue bill can pass. That's all just ahead, after a brief word from one of our advisory council members.
The Illinois Channel salutes our advisory council members.
Hello, I'm Michael Jacoby, Executive Director of the Illinois Association of School Business Officials. Most people never look at a school and think of it being an economic enterprise that spends tens of millions of dollars every year. They look at the school as a place their children attend for education, or perhaps as a place to attend a local sporting event. But handling the business of education is the job of the school business officials. We're the ones that keep track of the millions of dollars that come in and go out. Our members face a myriad of issues that include financing new buildings, paying teachers and staff, tracking our pension costs, and supervising the many businesses that contract with local schools. And that's why I'm so happy to serve on the Illinois Channel Advisory Council. The Illinois Channel connects us with legislators working on educational issues in the state capitol, as well as covering educational issues being discussed at conferences around the state. As we see in the debate over pensions, the many details involved in just that one issue, we need a news organization that's willing to give enough time to cover an important issue in depth. I'm Michael Jacoby, Executive Director of the Illinois Association of School Business Officials. I'm also proud to serve on the Illinois Channel's Advisory Council. The Illinois Channel, it keeps us connected to the issues that matter most.
Next, from Springfield, State Senator Andy Manar speaks at a luncheon hosted by the State University's Annuitants Association and talks about the budget impasse from the perspective of Senate Democrats. This runs about 35 minutes.
Well, thank you, Linda. Good, is it morning or afternoon? It's afternoon. Good afternoon. I appreciate Linda's invitation to speak with you for a few minutes today. If you're not from the 48th Senate District, welcome to the 48th Senate District, where you find yourselves today eating lunch. As Linda said, I was elected to the state Senate back in 2012. I represent a pretty good chunk of Springfield, most of the city of Decatur, all of the counties, all the way down to Edwardsville, though not Edwardsville proper, but pretty close. So it's a diverse set of communities, a diverse set of constituents that I represent. It's one of those crazy things called a swing Senate district. It could elect either a Democrat or a Republican on its face. In my opinion, there should be more of those, not less of those. I think that would help solve many of the problems that we face today in not just Illinois, but in our country, and all of the political discourse that we're being put through today on all levels of government. But enough of that. I want to thank you for your organization's advocacy in the Capitol building. Linda asked me to talk about the attack on public education for a few minutes today. Without your organization, things would be very different. So thank you for what you do individually and collectively as a group. And I want to thank your team as well, Linda and John and others that advocate on your behalf in the state capitol in what is undoubtedly a very difficult time in the state of Illinois. And it's going to be difficult for, I believe, for many fiscal years to come. So I want to start with a story. By the way, when I was trying to collect my thoughts on this, this is a lot of turf to cover because we've gone down what I think is a very dangerous path in recent years from as far as a perspective as privatizing public services, which is happening more and more, not just in Illinois, but across the country, to what is undoubtedly a full-throated assault on public pension systems, all the way over to the fiscal crisis that we face in the state. So that's a lot of turf to cover. And Linda also threw in Senate Bill 1, which, by the way, has passed both chambers and is now awaiting the governor's action. So I'm going to try to hit on each of those just for a few minutes, and then I'd be happy to take any questions and have a discussion with you this morning. But first, a story which I like to tell because A, it's true, this really happened to me, and B, it frames my view of so many things that deal with public education. So the summer of 2012, I was running for the state Senate. And if you remember that summer in 2012, it was hot. It was really hot. I think we went, in this area, we went, I think it was 4 or 5 weeks without rain. There was a good 2 weeks of 100-plus degree weather. When you're a candidate for the state Senate for the first time in an open Senate seat in downstate Illinois, what you do is you knock on every door that you can find. And that's what I found myself doing through that stretch of heat. So I was in a community of Mount Olive, which is a little bit further south, closer to St. Louis than it is Springfield on Interstate 55, old coal mining community. Mother Jones is buried in Mount Olive. I was knocking on doors, and I was walking down the street by myself. I had a list of voters that I was supposed to talk to, and I left that list of voters in my car, which was about a half a mile away. And so I just decided to do what any candidate should never do, which is just knock on every door and try to remember who I talked to. So I started to approach what was a small one-story apartment building. I think it had 3 units in it. It was, by the looks of it, subsidized housing, subsidized apartments. And I started to walk up to this door, and I heard a rumble of thunder in the background. And now, it hadn't rained for weeks, and I thought to myself, should I walk back to my car, or should I risk getting wet? Knowing it hadn't rained, I thought, well, I'll risk getting wet because it's not going to rain. And I took 10 steps to the front door of this apartment unit, and it started to pour. And I knocked on the door. And the door opened, and there was an elderly woman standing in front of me. And as I was getting soaked in the rain, this elderly woman said to me, "Andy, I've been waiting for you to knock on my door." Now, when you're a candidate running for office, you get a lot of things said to you. That is not one of them, right? And so I paused. And it took me about 30 seconds to realize that I was looking at my kindergarten teacher. Yeah. Mrs. Brines, who I hadn't seen in, I don't know how long, forever. She looked the same, by the way. She still does today. And so, by happenstance, it was raining, and she invited me in, and I sat in her living room for about a good half hour while it was raining, and she took me through her finances and what she pays for her health insurance and what she receives from her pension for teaching kindergarten students for years and years and years. And I don't have to explain to anybody in this room what the dynamics of that conversation were. But everything that comes in front of me as a state senator today in the state Senate goes through the prism of that conversation that I had with Mrs. Brines that hot day in July of 2012 in her maybe 4-room apartment, 3-room apartment in Mount Olive, who taught kids for a career. And so when people come up to me and say Mrs. Brines is unaffordable, that her pension's unaffordable, that her health care is unaffordable, I respectfully disagree with them. That's at the root of the division today down the street in the Capitol building on so many issues, whether it deals with how do we fund our obligations to the public pension systems, to how do we fund health care for retirees and current employees of state government and higher education, our university and community college systems, to how do we grapple with these things in a very difficult fiscal environment, and all the way to why we shouldn't privatize public education, in my opinion. All of those things go through that conversation, that filter of a conversation that I had with Mrs. Brines that afternoon. So I want to talk briefly about where we are and where I think we're going to go in the next 10 days. That's probably going to be the more brief part of my discussion with you this afternoon. And I want to preface what I'm going to tell you is simply that I don't consider myself an overly partisan person, but what I'm going to tell you may sound overly partisan. But I'm to the point with this budget disagreement that we're having now, going on several years, where I've learned to be very blunt with people and to give you my honest assessment about what's happening and what I see with my own eyes and report that to you. And you can take it for however you want. You can agree with me, you can disagree with me. What I'm trying to say is I'm just giving you my honest assessment about what's happening right now in the legislature and in state government. So first of all, it's been 1 year, 11 months, and 21 days since we've had a functional budget in place. So we're coming up on 2 years, on July the 1st. We've had stopgap measures in between. We've had 6-month budgets that excluded higher education in between. We've had these Band-Aids and pieces of duct tape that have been put on this situation time and again over the past near 2 years. But it's been 1 year, 11 months, and 21 days this morning. Number two, we're on the hook for $800 million in late penalties and interest payments to vendors. $800 million today. That's not small change. That number gets bigger to the tune of $11 million every single day that this budget impasse continues. So by the time you go to bed tonight versus the time you woke up this morning, we will have added collectively as a state $11 million to that $800 million figure. Well over 1,000 college students didn't return for a second semester in 2016 because of the specific reason of the uncertainty of the MAP grant program. For that reason. That's 1,000 college students that didn't return for a second semester. Now, let's figure out what happened to those students. I think you all know. Some of them will be lost forever. They exited higher education. They will never come back, or they'll come back years later when they ran out of choices in whatever path they chose to take. Some of those students went out of state, and they took their brain power, their future economic power as an individual, their future buying power, their kids, their future family with them, and they're not going to come back. I know some of those kids. I know them. They grew up in Bunker Hill. They're not going to be there anymore. They left the state to go to college elsewhere because of a disagreement we're having about whether or not we should fund the MAP program. Medicaid providers are owed over $2 billion today. Medicaid providers. Now, I always have to explain to constituents that what is a Medicaid provider? Well, they are employers. Many of them are small business owners that provide services that qualify for Medicaid coverage. They employ real people who have real children, who spend real money and buy real homes, real cars, real groceries, all the way down to, I was trying to think the most nominal interesting thing that's real and costs money, and I came up with a fidget spinner. They buy those too. Medicaid providers provide a lot of juice in our economy. They're owed $2 billion today. Illinois owes public schools, K through 12 schools, over $1.1 billion in reimbursements for services they provide, like busing kids, picking kids up, taking them to school. Governor Rauner often gives himself credit for having a record level of funding for K through 12 education. Record level of funding. You've heard him say it. Well, there's an asterisk next to that statement that contains two things. Number one, record level of funding in Illinois has resulted in record inequity among the haves and the have-nots. So that's number one. And the bigger piece of that asterisk is that the record level of funding has not been realized by public schools in the state because it hasn't been paid for. That's that $1.1 billion that's owed to public schools. The Senate, as Linda mentioned, has taken action beginning in January of 2017 to try to address this. It was called the Grand Bargain, and it had its starts and stops and its forward motion and backwards motion along the way, because bipartisanship is a really difficult concept for members of the legislature to grasp and to understand. That's reflected in the many starts and stops of the Grand Bargain in the Senate. But we wanted to negotiate with our counterparts in the Senate, and that's what we tried to do. The first thing we did, which is rarely talked about, but the first measure that we voted on in the Senate in January after the new General Assembly was sworn in, was a rule change, which sounds way too obscure and complicated. But the Senate governs itself through rules, just like any organization, just like you, just like any organization. And we adopted a rule in the Senate that would limit the leadership to term limits in the state Senate, both the Senate president and the minority leader. That was the first thing that we did in the Senate. And we did that right out of the gate to set a tone to say that we want to change how we're doing things. Along the way, we passed many important measures, some of which the governor was demanding, others of which Governor Rauner asked for, but didn't quite give us the details on what exactly he meant, so we made our own attempt. For example, consolidation of local governments. We have the most units of local governments in the country, and we need fewer, so we passed a measure in the Senate that we think would help address that. We passed workers' compensation reform, not the bill that the governor asked for on any particular day, but one that undoubtedly would save employers tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars over the next few years. That was a negotiated bill that took hours and hours of negotiation. That bill is sitting on the governor's desk today. We sought to balance the budget and implement school funding reform at the same time, which back in January we were told was nearly impossible. You can't reform school funding in Illinois, which is the third rail of Illinois politics. Kent has used that term many times, and balance the budget at the same time. That's too much, too heavy of a lift, can't be done. Well, we did that on May 23rd. And we passed not only school funding reform, but we passed a balanced budget. That balanced budget contains $3 billion in cuts, difficult cuts, many of which the governor suggested in his budget address on February 15th. It also includes revenue, which is intended to balance the cuts and acknowledge that we have to address that issue in order to have a sustainable budget for the state of Illinois, not just in this coming fiscal year, but for years to come. That was not an easy vote either. At the same time, we said that we acknowledge that Bruce Rauner is the chief executive of the state and was elected by the people of the state, and he put a number on spending of $37.3 billion. In his budget request, I was going to say suggestion, but it was a request, he said spend $37.3 billion. He didn't say how to pay for it, but he said that's what you ought to spend. That's what we spent in the Senate budget, was $37.3 billion. But we prioritized education, higher education, and health care. Now, we had to move some pieces around, but we lived within the governor's spending limit that he suggested. We raised revenue, and we implemented cuts that we thought weren't as much of a priority as those other three things that I mentioned. That bill passed the Senate with only Democrat votes, and it's now pending in the House of Representatives. For higher education specifically, just a few seconds on this. I go back to the governor's first budget. Shortly after he was elected, he submitted a budget to the legislature that would have, I think it all in all, it was a 60% reduction for higher education, universities, and community colleges. One after another, community college presidents, university presidents sat before our appropriations committees and said, if that budget goes into effect, we will double tuition. We will have to double tuition. We will have no other choice but to double tuition to community colleges and public universities. That's the result of what Governor Rauner suggested we do as a state. Now, the district I represent, for far too many kids, the University of Illinois is out of reach already today. That's not a knock on the University of Illinois, by the way, but it's too expensive. The doors are closed for financial reasons, for other reasons that we haven't been able to sift through. But doubling tuition at the University of Illinois or at SIU or ISU or any public institution in the state is not going to bode well for middle-class families or for our state's economy. That was a root that was put into the ground that is now a full-fledged fight between many of us in the legislature and Governor Rauner on how to prioritize higher education funding. That was the first root that was put into the ground. And that tree of discord is still growing down the street because we have a fundamental disagreement about the role of public education and specifically higher education in the state budget. That's at the root of one of our many problems that we face with the Rauner administration. Now, you know, along the way, we've tried to pass bills that appropriate money for higher ed. Most recently, the Senate passed a bill that would pay for what we appropriated. But all throughout this struggle, the governor's pretty much gotten what he asked for without action of the legislature. If you look at his first budget and what it prescribed and what it suggested, what he proposed, it's essentially what is taking place today. So one way or the other, and people like me who take this responsibility very seriously, I ask myself the question, well, you get up every day and you fight these battles and you try to do the right thing and you take difficult votes for revenue and cuts that on a normal day you wouldn't vote for. And you try to put forward agreements or bipartisan agreements that only become partisan. And at the end of the day, the governor's getting what he asked for, which is essentially a 50% cut to higher education. So that's where advocacy comes in. And this is how we got Senate Bill 1 passed finally out of the legislature. Your advocacy is absolutely imperative to the work that we're trying to do, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on. Your advocacy is absolutely imperative. Your voice as an individual to your state senator and your state representative, your voice collectively through this organization is an absolute imperative part of ending this fiscal crisis in the state. Because inaction has afforded the governor a victory in that his first budget for higher education is literally being implemented without action. So inaction is action in the eyes of Governor Rauner. And just look at the numbers. So that's where advocacy has to keep going. And I know it's going in ways that it's never gone before in the state, but it's got to get bigger. It's got to get louder. You have to make people in elective positions feel uncomfortable. That's okay. That's okay. That's part of the job, and it has to happen. Senate Bill 1, real quick. This has been a labor of love for me for many years. This one, too, was a result of a meeting I had with my superintendents after the election, before I got sworn in. We got as far as we've gotten with that bill, which the advocacy for this began long before I ever got to the legislature. People who served in the House and the Senate long before I was elected had laid the foundation for the passage of this bill the last week of May. But it was because of grassroots advocacy. It wasn't a top-down conversation. It wasn't because one member of the Senate proposed a bill. That has to happen. But what hadn't happened to date was the advocacy on a grassroots level from communities large and small, representing all different types of people, urban neighborhoods, small towns in downstate Illinois, suburban communities that are struggling under the least equitable system of school funding in the country. It was that advocacy that changed the dynamic in the legislature. That bill is sitting, well, soon to be sitting on the governor's desk, and we've asked him to hit the pause button and not have a political conversation about that bill, and have a conversation that's based in fact and reality, which is a challenge these days, frankly. So it's a once-in-a-lifetime chance in Illinois. I'll give you one metric, and then I'm going to stop, because I could do a seminar on this one. If you look at Illinois, in terms of how much money is spent on students that live in poverty versus students that do not live in poverty. So the most progressive state on this metric, students in poverty versus students not in poverty, is Ohio. So Ohio's over here, believe it or not. So for every dollar that is spent on a student that does not live in poverty in Ohio, the state of Ohio spends $1.22 for a student that lives in poverty. So $1 non-poverty, $1.22 poverty. That's Ohio. Then there's 48 other states on that spectrum from high to low, and then there's Illinois. So why is this one important? And you know this from the work that you do in higher education. The path out of poverty is education. That is the path, that is the only path out of poverty, is strong public education from preschool all the way through college or trade school. That makes someone competitive in the economy. That's the path out of poverty. So we also know that you can get the same outcome in high school of a student that lives in poverty who's only known poverty his or her entire life versus one that doesn't live in poverty. If you just spend a little more money on the student that lives in poverty in the right way, which is the evidence-based model that Linda suggested. So we know we can get the same outcome. It just takes a little more for that student that lives in poverty. So $1.22 in Ohio, Illinois is 81 cents. So for every dollar we spend on a non-poverty student, we spend 81 cents on a student that lives in poverty, which is opposite of what we ought to be doing. That's the nature of I use the word rotten. That's what I mean. Our system's rotten. So Senate Bill 1 that came about because of advocacy would just take that and turn it on its head. And it would require that the money be prioritized. New money going forward, that's the compromise, be prioritized to school districts that educate students that have poverty in their lives. It's that simple. And that took us decades to get to the point that we got to on May 31st. Advocacy does work, though. And that's how we're going to solve these problems, and that's how we're going to push back on issues that affect your lives, whether it's protecting pensions to asking just basic questions about privatizing public education to making sure that we have a budget that's balanced on paper and that's balanced in priority. So again, Linda, thank you for the invitation to come speak. I hope I didn't go on too long. I'll be happy to take any questions that you have.
Does anybody have questions? Hi, Andy.
Yep.
Marie Dawson, Illinois
Marie.
State University. Still working. Don't know when I'm going to retire, but it may be soon. Where's the increase in revenue? And because actually his first week in the office, he cut or let sunset the income tax increase. and that was very close to what the deficit would be. So where's the other income coming from? Casinos? Business? Taxes?
Yeah. Well, yeah, the question is where's the revenue come from? Or I'll tell you where I think it should come from. I'll tell you what the Senate passed, which was the result of our caucus working on this with the Republicans in the Senate. Let me back up though. A couple of numbers that are important. Under Governor Quinn, the unpaid bill backlog reached, I believe, a peak of about $9 billion. When Governor Rauner put his hand on the Bible and took the oath of office, it was down as far as about a little bit low, $2 billion, somewhere around there, which is sounds like a lot, but that's where it functionally should be. Okay, the time frame, $2 billion out of a $35 billion budget. Okay, that's 60 days. So it went from 9 to 2. Now it's back up we're up at what, 15 now. If we do nothing, by the way, if you talk to someone who says, well, this is too difficult to solve, we got to wait until after the next election, well, you should warn them that on election day in 2018, there's going to be $24 billion of unpaid bills sitting at the comptroller's office, because without a budget, there's an absence of control. There's money going out the door at a clip we've never seen before in history of the state. So the lack of a budget doesn't mean that money isn't being spent, except with the exception of a few things, higher education being one of them. It means that there's no controls over it. So back to your question, here's what we did in the Senate. We debated things like the sugary drink tax. Didn't fly. We debated whether or not we should remove the exemption of the income tax on retirement income. Didn't fly. We had any number of things, from a full-throated service, sales tax on services like every state around us does, all the way to, well, you've read them. You've read the things that we debated. Here's what we did. We did a partial reinstatement of the income tax rate back to what it was prior to Governor Rauner taking office. We removed some exemptions in the tax code that other states have removed that don't produce direct job growth and economic growth in the state. That was several $100 million. We apply the sales tax to a very limited number of services that I would describe as politically palatable. It's about $100 million. We also have some parity on things like satellite TV and cable, where one sector of that economic sector is paying the tax, the other isn't. We try to level those things out. We remove some exemptions for individuals who make over $500,000 of net income. For example, everybody gets a property tax credit to their income taxes for the property taxes. We means test that. We means test all kinds of things for those credits. So all in all, that raises it was just shy of $6 billion to help bring balance to the state budget. That has been criticized as too much. It has been criticized as not enough, which tells me it's probably pretty close to what it needs to be. Yes, sir.
I'm John Little from Governor's State.
Hi, John.
I currently live in Ohio, so it's good to hear that we're doing that. We do have a Republican governor who's been openly in opposition with Donald Trump, so
Yep.
maybe that's one of the reasons we're doing what we're doing. What I'm going to ask you is, what's your best prediction for what's going to happen with our retirement system?
So I would predict that there will be very few, if any, changes for current retirees at the end of the day. And you know that if there are changes that make their way through the legislative process and get signed into law for current retirees, that those will be challenged in court. Yes. You know that, as they should be, in my opinion. So I would predict very few, if any. You've seen those proposals dwindle down, from being many to very narrow today. I think what the focus will be is going to be specifically on a third tier for employees who have not been hired yet. And there seems to be some fairly unified support among both political parties on that concept. That's where I think the focus is going to be. And there's one, this is not with respect to higher education, but there's one tremendous pause button that has to be hit on that, in my opinion. The savings that are realized in the state budget are substantially for community colleges, and so in ICCB's budget, SERS, and TRS for K through 12, because in addition to benefit changes, which by the way have to be changed for TRS, because I personally think Tier 2 TRS is illegal, because participants are paying more in than they're ever going to get out. That's a fact. So here's the pause button. The pause button is that the cost of Tier 3 is going to be shifted to community college budgets and public school district budgets, which is a savings to the state budget, which should not just be lost in the shuffle. It should be reinvested in public education, but those costs have to be borne by someone. And that has to be fully debated, has not been debated to date. Yeah, there's pros and cons to that, by the way, but has not been debated yet.
Can we give a round of applause?
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jim McNamee, President of the Illinois Public Pension Fund Association. Since 1985, we've worked to educate the public and those who serve as trustees and pension boards about issues that impact the financial health of publicly funded pensions. Our members manage over $18 billion in pension assets. That's a huge number. But we never forget those dollars belong to the men and women who've worked as firefighters, police officers, and as educators. We want them to know that their pension dollars are safely invested. They also want to know that someone will keep an eye on legislation that could threaten their pension. And that's why the Illinois Public Pension Fund Association is fighting against laws that would reduce the pensions earned by our members. And this is why we support the work of the Illinois Channel. Their unbiased, in-depth coverage of the pension reform issue allows us and our members to hear arguments on both sides of the pension issue, to follow legislation as it moves through committee, or to hear unedited interviews with key lawmakers as they discuss what changes are being considered. Pensions are very important. They're also very complex. Pension reform can't adequately be covered in sound bites. But the Illinois Channel provides a connection to the Capitol, the governor, and lawmakers that we all need to stay on top of key issues. Hi, I'm Jim McNamee, President of the Illinois Public Pension Fund Association. I watch the Illinois Channel, and I hope you do too.
Next, from Springfield, State Senator Jason Barreckman holds a press conference to discuss the aspects of his legislation, Senate Bill 1124, which would reform the state's school funding formula. This runs about 40 minutes.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining us this morning. My name is Jason Barreckman, State Senator from the 53rd District out of Bloomington. We're here to talk about school funding, and you know, for the last several weeks there has been just a lot of over-the-top and unproductive rhetoric regarding our state's broken school funding formula. I think lost in all the accusations that people are committing ethical violations, that people are lying, there's been accusations that people are racist. Lost in all of that is the fundamental question of what we're trying to accomplish in our efforts to fix the broken school funding formula. We spent months, members of both chambers and both parties, through the Governor's Funding Reform Commission, we produced a report that outlined both the problem and a blueprint for moving forward. That blueprint includes the fact that Illinois has extreme disparities in the way they spend money on our school districts. The disparity that exists between our poor schools and our wealthier schools. This is the inequity that exists in the system that is there today. It's the problem that we're trying to solve, and amid all the accusations and the rhetoric, Members of both sides of the aisle, both chambers, claim that their goal is to fix this problem. The answer to whether we're accomplishing our goal, though, the goal again, to produce a fair and equitable solution for our poorest children, our neediest school districts, the evidence of whether a solution exists isn't established by personal feelings and emotion. It's not a subjective test. The question of whether we're producing a fair and equitable funding plan is established by an objective analysis that is both measurable and void of emotional influence. An objective analysis of SB 1 concludes, SB 1, the proposal advanced by Democrats in late May, an objective analysis of that legislation concludes that it falls well short of fulfilling this goal of a fair and equitable solution. In fact, Republicans have not, will not support that plan because we feel there is a better way to solving this problem. Now, that's not to say that Democrats haven't put forward some good ideas. In fact, the efforts of Senators Menard and Lightfoot in the Senate, Representative Will Davis over in the House, have put forward many good ideas. We've had ongoing discussions, even still today, about the good ideas that I think exist within both caucuses, members of both parties. The reality is, when you combine the good ideas of the Republicans and the Democrats, you get a better product. That's what Representative Pritchard and I have done in our legislation, Senate Bill 1124, his House Bill 4069. We have combined the good ideas put forward by Democrats and Republicans, put those in legislation, and it becomes an example where the whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts. By combining the best ideas of Republicans and Democrats, we achieve a more equitable result for our poor school children in our neediest schools. But you don't need to take my word for it. Look at the data, and that's what we're here to do today. How do we measure equity? We all know there are two drivers. These have been explained and discussed thoroughly. Two drivers. How many school children in a district are poor? In the materials that we've handed out today, this variable is called the low income percentage. You see it right there in that column. The second variable, what ability does a local school district have to raise funds? This is primarily done through property taxes at a local level. What ability does a school district have to raise funds to adequately provide a high-quality education for their students? In your materials, this is called an adequacy percentage. You'll note that there's no dispute between Republicans and Democrats about what percentages of low-income students exist in school district. There's also no question among Republicans and Democrats, and no difference in the legislation at how we treat adequacy percentages among the districts. So to explain what you've got, when you see the column labeled percent low income, if there's a high percentage there, some of our school districts are as high as 100%, that means there's a lot of poor kids in that school district. The lower the percent, the less poor kids. In the column labeled adequacy, it works in the other way. The question of whether districts have adequate funds is measured by a percentage, and those who have high percentages are believed on the data to have a high capacity of funding their schools at a local level. Thus, some of your higher percentages in this column reflect more of our schools who have adequate local resources. That's what you're looking at. That data comes from the Illinois State Board of Education. An equitable solution results in more state dollars being provided to districts with high percentages of low-income students and low percentages of adequate local resources. This is the problem, and that's what we're trying to solve. No one's ever disputed the methods of measuring equity. That's because these are data-driven variables. They're not influenced by people's perceptions of what is poor, what is adequate, or what is available. So to my earlier point, that when we combine the best ideas of Democrats and Republicans, we produce a more equitable result. All we have to do now is look at the data. I asked the Illinois State Board of Education to produce a simulation of Senate Bill 1124, and I've asked them to post the results of that simulation on their website. My understanding is that they will do that later here this morning. We anticipate around 11 o'clock. We've also provided you with a printed summary of that data that you can pour through today. And on the Senate Republican website, we have produced a comparison of this data in Senate Bill 1124 and a side-by-side analysis with Senate Bill 1. The goal being an apples-to-apples comparison of two pieces of legislation, and again, the desire to look at how we are addressing the inequities in the system. So let's take a few examples of what we see in the data. I'd point you to a couple of school districts, Aurora East Unit School District 131, Cicero School District 99, East St. Louis School District 189. All of these districts have 100% concentrations of poverty. But if you look further, you see that they each have different abilities of funding an adequate level of resources to their district based on property taxes. And as a result, Senate Bill 1124 drives more resources to the school of those three districts that have the same concentrations of poverty. We drive more resources to the schools who are furthest from adequacy, have less available local resources. In that case, it'd be Aurora East. We've provided you this information on a per pupil basis, which is a good method of comparing the data. We've also shown you the overall gain that those school districts would anticipate receiving. And again, on the Senate Republican website, and I think some of the materials you have, you see this side-by-side comparison to see, A, whether or not we're addressing the inequities, but B, that comparison with SB1 to see which method, in fact, solves that inequity problem that we all say we seek to solve. Now compare those school districts with lots of poor kids and less adequate local resources to some school districts who have very different circumstances locally. We looked at Downers Grove, Grade School District 58, Elmhurst School District 205. Respectively, those school districts have a 21% poverty concentration and a 17% poverty concentration, well below what some of our other poor districts see. In regards to available local resources, they have respectively 99% and 109% adequate local resources. This means they have less poor kids, more money available locally. The result of that is they get very little money through the formula because instead of sending it there, we're sending the money to the districts who are most in need. And importantly, I think we need to look at Chicago Public Schools, right? I think Senate Bill 1124 hits a middle ground, a sweet spot, if you may, by providing meaningful resources to CPS in accordance with the data and the formula, but not by using gimmicks and masking the true benefits that Chicago would see, which may lead some to conclude that it's a bailout. There's an important sweet spot here that can deliver meaningful resources to Chicago, but not allow people and taxpayers to conclude that it's a bailout. Now, again, I think a plan that combines the good ideas does a better job of fixing our inequitable system. I think the data proves it. The data proves that Senate Bill 1124 does a better job of fixing the inequitable system. Here's how we got to Senate Bill 1124. As you'll recall, it's been talked about over the last week what happened in late May in the negotiations that were commencing and occurring in the Senate. In fact, in late May, Democrats walked away from the table and they advanced a whole host of legislation which they said they were going to do on their own when they walked away from the negotiating table. What we've done in Senate Bill 1124 is looked at where the two parties were there then, and there was a lot of agreement between the two on school funding reform. We looked at where we were then, and we asked ourselves, how can we close the gap here to reach a meaningful compromise with the Democrat majority that allows us to produce a fair and equitable funding formula. The results shown in Senate Bill 1124, where Senate Bill 1124 agrees entirely with Senate Bill 1, it's the same language, on all of the issues of whether we use and how we use an evidence-based model, how we address poverty concentration, the tier structures, whether or not CPS is in Tier 1 or Tier 2. CPS remains in Tier 1, just like in Senate Bill 1. We applied the same regionalization factor and adjustments. All of those things that we've spent time all of us trying to understand what they do and why they do the things that they do, you see agreement among Republicans and Democrats, Senate Bill 1, Senate Bill 1124. What's left are only 4 areas where Republicans today are offering middle ground or compromises to close the gap and get this done. They deal with 4 things. A hold harmless. Senate Republicans have advocated, and the Governor's Funding Reform Commission agreed that we should do a hold harmless on a per pupil basis. The Democrats have advanced legislation that maintains a hold harmless on a district level. We split the gap and say, let's do the Democrat model for 3 years, and then let's switch to a per pupil basis beginning on year 4. Importantly, when you do that and you move that hold harmless to a per pupil basis, you free up resources that can then be placed in those districts who have the highest concentration of poor kids and the least available local resources. The second area is regarding the Chicago Block Grant. Republicans had proposed to do away with the block grant and remove the overage that Chicago receives as a result of that block grant. The Democrat proposal says that while they do away with the block grant, they embed the value of it within Chicago's base. Again, we try to split the difference and close the gap here by saying we both agree to do away with the block grant, and Republicans are proposing to continue funding in Chicago's base some of the value of the block grant. The sum is specific to funding for children, personal reimbursement, and summer school. The third area regards Chicago's pensions, and this is an area where, unfortunately, the pension problems of our state have bled into the various solutions to solve a school funding formula. The reality is we should be trying to fix the schools here, not trying to solve the pension crisis. But we understand that we need to try to move the ball forward here and, again, close the gap. So where Republicans had originally proposed that none of Chicago's pension payments and obligations would be picked up by the state, which is the law today, Democrats proposed that the state pick up the normal pension costs for Chicago, the health care costs for Chicago, and the legacy pension obligations for Chicago. We again try to close the gap by proposing that the state pick up the normal pension costs for Chicago. This is just like we do for the TRS, the state pension system for our teachers. And then lastly, in the area of mandate relief. In the area of mandate relief, Republicans have continually proposed ideas that are designed to give school districts more flexibility and allow them an ability to spend the limited resources they have in the most meaningful way based on local decisions. Republicans have continued to offer mandate relief. Democrats have not. Yet, we propose in our compromise language here that the mandate relief we offer removes some of the most objectionable items as reflected by the negotiations, the feedback that we received from Democrats during those negotiations. So again, we try to split the gap. And so, ultimately, when this is done, I think you see a product that does a couple of things. Number one, it reflects the priorities of both Republicans and Democrats who say they want to fix an inequitable and broken school funding system. We think Senate Bill 1124, by incorporating the ideas of both parties and the members who've shown and demonstrated leadership on this, by incorporating those ideas, we believe on the data that we have produced a better result, a more equitable result that again solves the problem of our broken school funding system. Importantly, we do this by living within the budget that's been proposed by Republicans. That budget number proposes a spend number on schools that is identical to the budget proposed by Senate Democrats, so there's no disagreement in how much to spend. Again, ours adopts that model. This model produces no red numbers. Nobody loses money. Every school district stands to gain, but the school districts who stand to gain the most are the ones who have the highest concentration of poor kids and the least ability to meet their needs locally. Chicago is one of those school districts, and as a result, Chicago will see meaningful gains by this formula. In doing so, they stand next to and alongside hundreds of other school districts in this state who face equal challenges to Chicago in regards to the poverty concentration that they have locally and the availability that they have to satisfy their needs through property taxes. So with that, my call today and my urge today is that the Democratic leaders in both the House and the Senate will take this proposal up. Obviously, people are going to give it due scrutiny. We think, again, we've hit a sweet spot. My desire is that the Democrats give this ample consideration and that we expeditiously see it move forward for a vote. I think we can draw bipartisan support on this plan, and that we can then move forward and change the law and fix the broken system that we have. With that, I'm glad to take any questions.
Well, Senator, you explained it a little bit, but I'd like for you to do it again. Regarding Chicago, you and the governor and everyone else said Senate Bill 1 was a bailout for Chicago. And just going by the numbers at the end here on the last page, $164 million in your bill versus $70 million for Senate Bill 1. More than twice the extra money for Chicago.
Yes.
You're saying this isn't a bailout.
So Dave, you're reading the printouts that we've provided. Republicans continued, and I continue to believe, that the numbers published for Senate Bill 1 masked and hid the true benefit to Chicago. As a result, what you're looking at appears to purport that the Republican proposal spends more money in total and on a per-pupil basis in Chicago than what was delivered under Senate Bill 1. And you call that into question. We, too, called into question whether the numbers published by Senate Bill 1 were, in fact, accurate. We don't believe they are. I still don't believe that they are. And while I can point you to where the areas in the formula where we think the Democrats hid money and manipulated the formula to Chicago's benefit, the reality is they produced the numbers on Senate Bill 1 that you're comparing this to, and on their numbers, apparently, the Republican model spends more on Chicago. I think when people dig into the details, what we'll all find is that the Republican suggestions before are true, that in fact Senate Bill 1 hid and masked a lot of money, hundreds of millions of dollars for Chicago. The Democrats who advanced the formula simply weren't open and transparent about what they were doing. And quite frankly, it worked to their advantage. In those final days of the May session, the reality is this Senate Bill 1 advanced out of the Senate, moved over to the House where there were some negotiations, and then the Democrats in the House moved quickly on an amendment that Republicans heavily criticized. They pushed forward, Speaker Madigan pushed forward a vote. There was a lot of arm twisting on it. I think a lot of members probably voted with less than the information that we would hope to have on such an important vote. And I think that when the real numbers for Senate Bill 1 are produced, I think it creates an impossible situation or possibility for Senate Bill 1 to receive the same vote total that it did in late May.
So the low-ball
Who
numbers.
decided ultimately what schools in the downstate got more money? Who made that decision? Schools. I know the formula, but I mean, was it your input? Who decided that what downstate schools would get more?
It is not the public officials. The data, as a result of input from the education community, produces 27 data elements for which the State Board of Education can run individualized school district data through. And when that happens, the dollars flow where they may based on those data. It has nothing to do with any legislator's view. Our point, our contention is, so long as you don't manipulate the data, you get a pure result. And I think that's what you see in Senate Bill 1124. We have accepted the fact that if you follow the data, then the conclusions, where the dollars go, get in the best place where they're needed. It's the best place where taxpayers can look at it and say, that makes sense, and it gets the dollars in those neediest school districts.
Where the money will be spent.
We want.
Where's it coming from? You're proposing more money than Senate Bill 1 had, but where is this additional revenue coming from?
No, Senate Bill 1 and this model, I can't speak to the presumptions made in Senate Bill 1. I think Senate Bill 1 proposes to spend more money than the Senate Democrat budget and appropriation that is separate legislation. Nonetheless, Senate Bill 1124 proposes to spend additional money. That additional money is found in the capital compromise, the budget offered up by Republicans last week. It's that number.
Let's go back onto these numbers and
Sure.
identify what they each represent.
Sure.
So in the overall gain category,
Mhm.
SB 1124, those numbers are ISB runs
Correct.
based off of
The budget proposal proposed by Republicans, $288. I think the spend is $288.
Okay, so this reflects a whole harmless plus 288 distributed amongst the schools according to the new formula.
Yes.
The SB1 category, where do those numbers come from?
Those are the numbers published by the State Board of Education, and those are the numbers that were flying around here in late May.
Okay, so those are ISB numbers as well?
Yes.
Okay.
And in fact, if
the methodology is the same on both of them?
they're different formulas.
But ISB's methodology for running the numbers, the numbers were run by the same people following the same
Yes.
methodology?
Yes.
Okay, so they're comparable numbers.
Yes. If you, and I just want to interrupt you 1 second. If you go to the State Board of Education website, some of you may have been there, there's a number of links to Excel spreadsheets. One of those links will be published today. It says Senate Bill 1124, Amendment 3. In that link, you will see an overall gain for Senate Bill 1124. If you go to a separate link on the ISB website for Senate Bill 1, Amendment, the version that's passed both chambers, and looked in that same column of overall gain, these are the numbers that you'll see. Our staff, simply put them side by side for all of our benefit to do an apples-to-apples comparison. Hold on.
And when you look at these numbers, it looks like in every instance, every school district gets considerably more on your bill versus SB1. So where is that money coming from? I think that's the question, is like how...
Yeah, this is when Republicans said during the vote, the deliberations on Senate Bill 1, remember what we said. We said that the sponsors had manipulated the formula, baked into the base assumptions and dollars that weren't reflected in the spreadsheets that they produced. When you remove those manipulations, the gimmicks used to bake things into the base, it frees up dollars that then can be distributed to all schools in need. That's all that we've done. And that's what Senate Bill 1124 does.
But these numbers come from ISB, not the people who wrote SB1.
ISB had to run a simulation of SB1 with the language in that hundreds of pages of legislation. In those hundreds of pages are manipulations that were designed to benefit the Chicago public school system. When you remove the manipulations in the legislation and provide the legislation to ISB, they show a different outcome. It's an outcome that still benefits CPS, but we've removed the dollars baked in and hidden and instead distributed through the formula, which is what the goal here is. We distribute those dollars through the formula. CPS benefits from that. That's why, to Dave's question, why do your numbers on a per pupil basis as stacked up against CPS appear to spend more? Because we are spending more money through the formula on Chicago than was purported in SB1.
So SB1 is lowball, a phony, and a bailout, yet SB 1124, which by these numbers is more than twice as much for Chicago, is not a bailout for Chicago.
I think that the reality of SB1 is that there's more money hidden for Chicago than is disclosed by the sponsors. Sure. I would direct you. Time out. I would direct you to the State Board of Education, who has modeled Senate Bill 1 with the Senate Democrat budget appropriation, and you'll see a very different result. I think so. I think you have to go there for some of those answers. I come back to the response that I gave earlier. When you remove, our job's to write the law or the legislation. And when you change the manipulations in the sentences of that law and provide that to ISB to model and to run a simulation, the results are very different. And that's what we expect.
Senator, again, to the question of how are you going to pay for this? There were Democrats in here just before. They left a sponsor slip there for the Senate Bill 9 to have any kind of amendments. How are you going to pay for this, any kind of increase in education? And then also, how are you going to ensure that the money stays in the classroom? It doesn't go to bureaucracies with 800 plus school districts and bloated budgets and so on.
Yeah, so there's an ongoing debate. Hopefully, we encourage a negotiation over the budget. Obviously, we're not at the finish line. Republicans and the governor has continually said that as part of those negotiations, we are willing to put Republican support on a revenue package that's coupled with meaningful reforms for the state of Illinois economy and taxpayers. That debate continues. I think the Democrat idea is to spike the football before they're in the end zone on that. It's a little premature. But I am encouraged that the message I heard earlier today from some of our Democratic colleagues is that they want a further negotiation, as do we. And I think we all know where that needs to happen. President Cullerton points at Speaker Madigan. We point at Speaker Madigan. The guy's yet to propose anything, either way, and it's time for him to step forward and tell us which direction he wants to go. However, we're here to your second part of the question. We're here on how we fix the broken school funding formula. And you raise an interesting question, and one that deserves attention, which is how do we make sure that the money that is provided by the state to school districts is being spent on the services that are necessary to providing that high-quality education, not being spent on bureaucracy and bloat that is the concern of taxpayers. The answer to that is you adopt an evidence-based model. That's why we proposed what we have, and that's why I think you see wide agreement among Republicans and Democrats that the expenditure of state dollars when run through an evidence-based model puts the dollars in the districts who need them the most and is backed up by data and best practices, not as suggested by public officials, but as suggested by the education community.
These numbers here, and they're both from the State Board of Education, and they come out higher for Chicago in yours than theirs. Are you saying the Board of Education is knowingly participating in a fraud?
No, not at all. Not at all.
What is the language you're talking about that's hidden that they don't know about? Why wouldn't they know about it?
We can provide you instructions that will direct you to the cells that in fact disclose the hidden money for Chicago.
Do you have that language?
We have that, and our staff will pass it out. Basically, we're going to instruct you to go to the website. We're going to tell you where to click and which cells to look at. And when you get there, what you'll see is at a minimum, in one circumstance, $418 million that was never disclosed by the sponsors of SB 1, $418 million in benefits to Chicago, for which it took, these spreadsheets are monstrous, and it took us a lot of time. We weren't able to locate that immediately, but we have since found that. It's not a Senate Republican analysis. It's the data that is produced by the State Board of Education. It's in there. Simply the proponents of SB 1 never directed anyone where to look at it.
One or two examples of those.
Sure. There is, we call it the base, right? There is a base funding level for which every school district starts, and then when you apply money through the formula, the evidence-based model, dollars go to a district on top of that base. You will see in the State Board simulation for SB 1 that every school district has a base that is consistent, that is not manipulated. Yet when you look at the line item for Chicago, what you will see is that there is $418 million added to one cell. It's a manipulation that exists nowhere else in the spreadsheet. ISB did what the legislative language of SB 1 instructed them to do. So it's not their fault it's there, it's to their credit that they did it just like the legislation proposed. No one pointed any of you, or any of us for that matter, to that information because it was more convenient to point to per pupil spending amounts in the formula and draw people's attention to those rows and columns rather than the important column, which is, where are we starting with all this? What's people's base? And when you manipulate Chicago's base, you put resources there first before you put money into the formula. And what that means is when Senate Bill 1124 extracts that manipulation, it freed up $418 million that we then applied through the formula. Benefiting.
Does that number exceed the amount of money that CPS received in fiscal year 2017, or was supposed to receive between general state and categoricals? That number that includes the $418 million, is it equivalent to what they received in this fiscal year?
I can't answer that. I mean, yeah, the four. I wish I had my notes for that. I don't. Yeah.
Part of the whole formula, isn't it?
It is part of the block grant. I believe it is part of the block grant that was removed by law, but the value is baked into Chicago's base, plus the cost of the CPS normal pension cost, I believe, is the walk-up to that number. And again, we'll provide you the details of that.
So every other school district has their pension costs covered by the state. Why is it not fair to bake that into Chicago's base? Essentially baked in, granted in another bill or in another form of law, but it is essentially baked in for every other school.
No, we propose, Senate Bill 1124 and the budget proposed by Republicans proposes to treat CPS's pensions the same as we do TRS. We don't try to bake it in. There's no TRS payment baked into people's base. There's a payment made by the state of Illinois towards TRS, right? We propose to do that to the Chicago pension fund rather than doing what the Democrats did, which was bake it into the base without disclosing that as an obvious thing that they've done. When we discovered what they've done, we said there's a better way, a more transparent way to do this. So we both agree that the state should pick up the normal pension cost for CPS. We simply propose to do it in the same manner that we treat every other school district, rather than hiding it within a base and hiding it with the formula.
Why should Chicago not get any money for the legacy pension costs? For all of these years that the state has been paying that for other districts, and now Chicago, that would have been a huge payment.
Well, remember, Amanda, we're here trying to fix a broken school funding formula. We all acknowledge the pension crisis that exists. Nowhere. In fact, we spent months at the Reform Commission. There was explicit discussion on whether our charge there was to fix the formula and fix the pension system, and both sides agreed. The charge is to fix the formula. So trying to create a solution to an inequitable formula that also fixes a broken pension system, never been the goal, and that's not what I'm trying to do here.
But one of the arguments that CPS makes is that they have to take money that they have on hand and pay it towards their legacy costs. And that it's unfair to count this is where the formula comes in, and it's unfair to count their formula to include that money that's really spoken for already as part of their adequacy target. Do you agree with that?
This is an example where the Democrats have continued, there's been a lot of blame that Republicans have moved the goalpost. This is an example of the Democrats moving the goalpost. We have heard a year ago and more from Speaker Madigan and President Cullerton that they asked the state of Illinois to pick up the Chicago normal pension cost. Republicans stand here today offering to do just that. The fact that Democrats in Chicago now is coming at the 11th hour with an additional request is simply an example of them moving the goalpost and making it incredibly difficult to get to a solution here as June 30th approaches.
It's 11:55, almost midnight. Should there be a stopgap education, standalone education?
No, we need to focus on a full year budget, a balanced budget, and why we're here today. We need to adopt meaningful reforms to many areas of the state, including our broken school funding formula. That's the proposal that Republicans have offered today. I think the proposal again adopts the many good ideas that have been proposed by members of both parties, and I think this represents a real solution that the governor can sign into law and provide meaningful results to many needy school children and school districts all around our state.
Does this provide any funding at all for Chicago legacy pension issues?
It provides Chicago meaningful dollars, and I get you the number here in a second, but it provides Chicago meaningful dollars that they then have the flexibility to use in the manner that they deem the best. We are trying to address some of the concerns that they've raised, and we're doing so. We're putting our name behind it as Republicans, but we're doing it in a way that recognizes that Chicago is among many other schools facing financial challenges that arise from lots of poor kids and a lack of local resources. When we treat Chicago fairly and the same as we treat other similar school districts, they receive a benefit, and that's what we're proposing here today.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Next, from Springfield, we attend a press conference in which Democrat State Senators Heather Staines and Toy Hutchinson call on the House to revisit SB 9, a budget bill which passed the Senate, and work to negotiate on certain measures so a revenue bill can pass. This runs about 20 minutes.
Senator from the 7th District, which is the northernmost part of the city of Chicago and a little bit of Evanston. Here today, there's been a lot of discussion about the budget proposal Rauner had put forth and the Republicans, and us taking that up as a compromise proposal. And what I wanted to do today, and with Senator Hutchinson, is point out, first and foremost, that the only comprehensive budget proposal that exists right now is something that the Senate has passed and is, it lies right now in the House of Representatives, and that's where the negotiations need to be taking place. What the Republicans have put forward is not balanced. It includes not a single revenue bill. It doesn't include any revenue, so it is in itself out of balance. It certainly spends at a level that presumes revenue, but they did not include any revenue bill in what they have put forth. So it's inherently out of balance. We're going to have Senator Hutchinson talk about that in more detail. The other point I wanted to make is that a lot of what they put in the spending bills themselves really had been reflecting a lot of compromise that we had been doing in the Senate. So the Senate, me as an appropriate chair and Toy as our revenue chair, as well as Senator Menard and Senator Trotter, had met numerous times with the Senate Republican point people on the budget negotiations. And we did come up very close to what is in the spending bills that the Republicans put forth. What I don't know that you and the public understand is that we put those exact bills, practically these exact bills, up on the board for a vote on May 17th, and we got 0 Republican votes. Practically exactly what was there, we got 0 Republican votes. So that's why we went to a different budget plan the following week that we could pass with just Democratic votes. And many of the other pieces of the compromise, big compromise package, we also had done with bipartisan support. Going into the local consolidation was bipartisan support. We've done the procurement reform that a lot of the budget relies on as bipartisan support. We had done pension reform that the budget relies on bipartisan support. All those pieces reside over in the House. Again, we believe that what needs to happen right now is the negotiations need to take place in the House. If the Senate Republicans are now coming back to the set of budgets that they themselves did not vote on May 17th, I think they should work with the House Republican colleagues and say, yes, this is something that we would like to support, and can you work to amend the bills that are over in the Senate? We will welcome them if they come back, if they are able to pass in the House with bipartisan support, we will welcome and take them up in the Senate. I'm going to ask Senator Hutchinson now to talk a little bit more about the lack of a revenue bill in their package.
Morning, everybody. I'm Toy Hutchinson, Senator of the 40th District, which is the southern part of Cook County, Kankakee, Will, and Grundy. I'm here really just to point out the fact that the hardest part of working on a budget is the revenue side, the hardest part. Almost everybody can come in and talk about how they want to spend money. But one of the reasons we find ourselves in this situation is because almost nobody wants to talk about where that money is going to come from. We filed Senate Bill 9 on January 11th, so it has been in the universe for months and months and months. Clearly, it wasn't passed until May because we were really giving it as much possible time as we could to come to a bipartisan solution. So we stand here, both Senator Staines and I, our entire caucus, saying that we've kind of put everything we have on the line towards unity, towards compromise, towards we need to work on this together in a bipartisan framework. That was the goal from January 11th through the entire session. The package of bills that have been released now notably don't have a revenue component, although it does assume the revenue pieces of Senate Bill 9. But Senate Bill 9 didn't get any votes in the Senate so that it could go over to the House. And if you remember, when I was standing up on the floor closing Senate Bill 9, I kept saying we cannot run down the clock. We cannot continue to run down the clock. That was on May 23rd. I asked, what are we supposed to do when we get downgraded? Again, what are we supposed to do when we end up in junk status? We cannot run down the clock to the point where the House doesn't have enough time in a bipartisan fashion to come together and actually put real substantive amendments on a package of bills that by all accounts are very, very close. So I am really looking forward to seeing what the revenue package is going to be, whether there'll be any amendments that'll be filed reflecting the changes that they'd like to see. And of course, and I'm actually saying, of course, we'll take that up. But right now, we don't have any amendments. We have no co-sponsors. We have no amendments filed on the most crucial piece of this budget package, which is the money. Now, I know the responses that I've gotten over the last 5.5, nearly 6 months, in some ways have been brutal. But so is the situation that the state is facing right now. It's brutal. And when we allow ourselves to be stuck into these separate corners as if everyone that's being affected by this or impacted by this aren't taxpayers. People who run their businesses and expect to be paid for their work are taxpayers. People who work in these social service agencies that are literally being decimated are taxpayers. People who run child care centers for whom we're still missing almost 50,000 kids, they're taxpayers. We are all in this together. It's going to take all of us together, and it cannot continue to be a situation where we're required to compromise on reforms, but it's just our tax increase. That is, if we're really going to be working in the spirit of unity and bipartisan cooperation so that we can end this once and for all, file the amendments, sign on as co-sponsors, get them back over on concurrence, and this could be over in a day.
The Republicans had a handout where they said that they would make some modifications to Senate Bill 9. A couple of, one of them was not retroactivity and 4-year income tax or 4-year property tax freeze. So how can you explain they don't have a revenue package given what they said in a press release yesterday?
What they said in a press release yesterday was that they assumed Senate Bill 9, which got no Republican votes. And I'm very interested, all of us are very interested in a bipartisan solution to this, which means we need to see amendments to Senate Bill 9 so that they can join, like if they say that they're going to support that, we'd like to see the amendments filed and the co-sponsorships to say, which would give us some indication as to whether or not they would vote for it. Right now, we have no amendments and we have no co-sponsors. We have an assumption of a bill that got absolutely no votes. That's not compromise.
Now, I've got one more question. If I'm a lawmaker, regardless of party and regardless of chamber, I might have a feeling the governor doesn't have my back. That, you know, I'm going to be in some stupid ad or whatever, and it's just going to be terrible. I mean, is that a valid thought? How much of that plays into this? Not only voting for a tax increase, but then having the governor, turn against me.
I don't really know exactly how to answer that, other than the fact that I think that most of our constituencies want us to do the best we can with the information we have as a situation that currently faces us. And there are a lot of things that happen politically that tend to impede on our work here in the dome, under the dome. And I would just say to most of my colleagues that this is a time for us to concentrate on what it is we were sent here to do. And every single day that goes by, if we're only making political calculations, that doesn't say very much for the people that we were sent here to serve.
Can I add to that?
Yep.
Oh, never mind.
Was making the tax temporary and not making it retroactive, are those things that you would consider or be in favor of?
What I am most hopeful for is a bipartisan package that comes back to the Senate. There's no way in the world that if we get Republican votes and Democratic votes on a package to end this impasse, that the Senate would do anything less than take that up. We are in a moment in time right now, and June 30th is coming very, very quickly. But I felt that same urgency for May 31st.
And can I say, in all of our negotiations in the Senate, as when we were negotiating with Republicans and the Democrats, there was, I think it was practically non-existent, the things that we said are non-starters that we took off the table. We are open to anything that gets us to a bipartisan solution to end the impasse. We thought we were really close. We put things up on the board. In fact, we put this very similar budget to exactly what they proposed in this capital compromise up on the board and got 0 votes. We're hopeful now that they are, in fact, ready to start putting votes on an actual bipartisan solution. We think that needs to be happening in the House and come back. We had a lot of time in this chamber that we've been debating this. They have not had that chance to do it in the House. The House needs to start getting engaged and actually negotiating and sending something back to us.
Said engaged probably 8 times yesterday to the press. He said that, the past couple of weeks we've been working on this. Is there something else that, and specifically to Speaker Madigan, you could say, and his leadership to get this going? I mean, you got the House offering up their plan, even saying about the revenue aspect of it. If we get substantive workers' comp reform and the property tax freeze that's meaningful, then we'll support revenue. Where's the speaker on this?
I can't answer that. What we have done in the Senate is work extremely hard for nearly 6 months to try to get this to the point where, the goal, I remember when we had the first press conference and said we were going to list all these bills and we were going to get to work on negotiating these things. And so I want to remind people about how the legislative process actually works. The cleanest thing to happen would be to take the framework that is now out of the Senate, is in the House, amend those bills and send them back to the Senate. What we saw over the last couple of weeks was a rush to file a whole bunch of brand new bills, but absent the one that actually would make all of them go. So I think what we're standing here saying now is that we're standing here ready, we're willing, we desperately want this thing to be over. And we want to see that instead of having conversations about commercials and radio spots and campaign ads and newspaper articles, let's debate bills, amendments that actually make the changes that folks say they want to see so that it will garner their vote so we can actually take action. That's what we're here to talk about today.
President was basically right after the announcement of special session saying, quote, we're not going to vote for anything. We've all alluding to that we've already done our work.
So,
how does this, I'm confused with, you're saying we're ready to compromise, but the Senate President said we're not.
No, I think those are entirely consistent. Yeah. The idea being that where you first, we can be happily involved in the discussions around compromise, but the votes at this point, we have a complete comprehensive set of bills sitting in the House where the votes first need to take place is there and come back to the House, and then we'll take that up. So very much open to compromise. The votes just need to happen in the House first, as we have already passed a complete, comprehensive set of proposals on both the reforms, every single one of the reforms the governor says he wants, as well as the budget, as well as the revenue. We've passed all of them, and they are all residing in the House. That's where the votes now need to happen and come back to us, and we will happily take them up and do concurrence.
Are there actual conversations happening right now with Republicans, and what kind of negotiations are taking place in press conferences, side meetings?
I mean, we continue to talk. That's always taking place. Where the negotiations need to be happening, and I hope and think that they are, trust that they are, is in the House right now. I think that's where you need to start seeing amendments getting filed in the House. That's going to absolutely take Republicans and Democrats coming together. As we're in overtime now, it takes 71 votes. They don't have just 71 in either party. It's going to have to take both Republicans and Democrats. I believe those conversations are happening in the House.
We trust that they are happening right now. And we also want to be very clear about the fact that we send chambers, pieces of legislation go between the chambers all the time. There are plenty of times when people stand up and say, we're going to continue working on this House, working on this in the other chamber to get it where it needs to be before it gets to the governor's desk. We have never in the Senate said that our package was the end-all, be-all, that it was never going to be changed. We said very clearly on all of these things, especially on May 23rd, we need to give the House time to work on this so that they can send it back. It is our absolute dream that they will get where they need to be at 71 votes with Democrats and Republicans so that those no votes in the Senate are then turned to yes votes. Our Senate Republicans can then stand up for what their House colleagues did. We can do this on concurrence and get it to the governor's desk, thereby making a 100% bipartisan, fully negotiated package. That's the way this thing works. You don't file new bills at the end of session. There's a vehicle over there, actually not even the end of session, well past the deadline. There are vehicles that are waiting, that are primed to be taken up, that are reflect what almost everybody said has gotten to very, very close points. They need to be amended and filed with co-sponsors and things that say, this is what we believe, this is how we know we're going to make it work, and this is how we're going to get the votes to do it. Right now, we have no amendments on Senate Bill 9. We have no standalone revenue bill to make the bills that they filed in the Senate anything. We need to work with the framework that we've sent over there happening. It's a two-chamber situation. It's a two-party situation. And the only way to work on this together is to get it done where it actually exists, in the chamber that it actually exists in. So we're waiting for that to come back to us. That does not mean we're not going to work on it. It means it comes back on concurrence and we do the regular legislative process. We take those bills up on concurrence.
We're going to set two public hearings on the committee of the whole today and tomorrow at 2 o'clock on a couple of key issues. Are these just a waste of time? I mean, should these not be happening, and should real work behind closed doors be happening on Senate Bill?
Well, that's a better question for folks in the House. I mean, certainly I think people can chew gum and, and walk at the same time. These are all part of what I think we understand with the Republicans, that they need all parts of it. They don't want just budget bills. They also want reform. So I think by definition, you have to be talking about both those things at the same time.
Republicans yesterday, they gave themselves credit, of course, they gave your caucus credit, but they were very doubtful of the Speaker. And the Speaker, at the end of the session, all he said about your bills were to take them into thoughtful consideration. It doesn't sound like a ringing endorsement. So in your caucus, is the trust there for the Speaker that he's not going to blow this up at the 11th hour for his political?
I think this the state of what's happening in Illinois right now and the devastation that's going on, I believe that everyone has the goal of providing predictability, stability, financial security for everyone in the state. This is devastating. I think we've got to stop all the layoffs that are going off in the universities, all the kids who are no longer willing to look in Illinois, all the people who are moving out of the state, all the social service agencies that are shutting their doors, the schools that are not going to be open in time without a budget in the fall. I think everybody believes we need to bring this to an end. I really believe in good spirit. Everybody knows that we need to do that and is working towards that goal.
Any appetite at all for a standalone school funding bill? Is that a conversation that's happening?
We are, in the Senate, I think we've been incredibly consistent. We do not support doing a stopgap budget. Period. And at this point, we have, I think it's 500 school superintendents from school districts around the state that have said even doing a stopgap is meaningless. There's no dollars there behind it. When we have a backlog of $15 billion in bills, even getting a stopgap doesn't mean there's any revenue to get out the door to the schools. That's the problem. That's what we see happening right now. They haven't been getting a lot of their payments that are already due to them right now because of the backlog and not having the revenue to support the spending level we're at. Stopgap just doesn't work. It's meaningless at this point in time.
Senator, you said it was time for this to end. I might say the time for this to end was 2014 or
I agree.
Some past time when allegedly we had a balanced budget. So I mean, if you'd said we would go 2 years with no budget, I mean, you'd be going to use an indelicate term, a funny farm. But here we are, so I'm not really convinced that enough people really want a budget, because we've gone 2 years, we're ready to go a third. I'm sure the governor is. I mean, why should we believe this?
We stand by the work that we've done in the Senate over the last 6 months. We are proud of the hundreds of hours we spent with our colleagues. When Heather and I first started having these bipartisan meetings, we started doing those about 2 years ago. And, you know, there are people in this building, there are legislators in this building who believe wholeheartedly that there's nothing any of us can do alone, nothing. We as a General Assembly need to pass a budget, as a General Assembly, both chambers, and the governor needs to sign it. So we stand by what it is we've done. We stand by the work that we put into this. We appreciate anybody who wants to come in and help us get to the finish line. But we're here to say right now that a budget, a full budget package, is not just where you want to spend the money. It's also the hard part, is where the money comes from. It's the one part that hardly anybody wants to talk about. But it's also the thing that makes this state run. So if we can do this in an open, transparent way, in a bipartisan way, we all stand ready to support that. And over the last 6 months, the Senate Democratic Caucus has proven that time and time again. And I would say we've proven that by the acknowledgement of the other side that said the package that they lit, it's very close. It is very close. So we can't let we can't let unnecessary things stand in the way of saving this state. The state, we can all do better than this.
It seems like one of the big things here is trading reforms for revenues. Republicans will get on board if they have in place. Before session ended, a couple of workers' comp bills went back and forth. One created a state-funded workers' comp company. Republicans said that's not reform. So ultimately, I think Republicans may be looking for substantive reforms first. I know you said you can, do both things at the same time. But do you think that adds to the question of trust? They're looking for substantive reforms they can get behind before actually signing off to any tax increases or filing amendments to your bill.
See, the issue that we're facing right now is that we have two parties with different ideological focuses, and that's just a given. That's why we're two different parties. So compromise means that everybody's not going to get everything they want. We're not going to get everything we want. They're not going to get everything they want. We have to do this together. So if the answer is always, that's not enough, we need more time, that's not enough, we are now at a point where we are one notch above junk status. So at some point, we're going to have to say, you know what, this is the best deal we can get, and we're going to live to fight another day, and you do that on the field. But under the dome, we are negotiating with people who don't agree with us. So, and it's not, and I'm going to say this, I've said this privately all over the place, and anytime I get a chance to talk about it, you can't have one set of folks say, our ideas are firmly held beliefs, yours, because you disagree, are corrupt per se. Everybody has their own firmly held beliefs. I'm a Democrat that believes in collective bargaining. I don't think that that's the scourge of the state. I know that there are people on the other side of the aisle who firmly disagree with me on that. Right now, we need to deal with the situation at hand, what we are dealing with today. And leadership is not about beating people over the head and making them follow you. It's about stating your case and making people want to go where you're going. And right now, we need all of us in on that play. All of us. Everybody on the field. All hands on deck. So everybody's not going to get what they want. That's the definition of divided government. That's just the definition of it. So at some point, enough is enough. Do the compromise, do the deal, let's get this done.
The Illinois Channel salutes our advisory council members, leaders in business, education, law, medicine, and other fields from across Illinois.
I'm Mark Beal, Executive Director of the Chemical Industry Council of Illinois. We represent over 220 companies, employing almost 46,000 people at over 700 facilities located across Illinois. These are the kind of jobs any state would wish to have, with an average annual wage of over $81,000 per year. To keep these kind of quality jobs in Illinois means we need to keep a competitive business climate with other states. Our tax rates, regulations, transportation infrastructure, the quality and education of our workers, these factors all combine to create a climate that's going to attract new businesses or in some cases keep them away. That's why the Chemical Industry Council of Illinois supports the work of the Illinois Channel. They bring us into the Capitol to hear debate on such issues as reforming the workers' compensation system, health care reform, and the debate over changing the state's pensions. These are among the issues covered by the Illinois Channel that affect all of us. Taken together, they create a business climate that will keep the Illinois economy growing or cause it to slip into further decline. That's why we all need to know what's happening on policy issues affecting our state and our communities. That's why I watch the Illinois Channel, and I hope you do too. The Illinois Channel. It works for all of us.
Next, from Springfield, we talked to Greg Bays, President and CEO of the Illinois Manufacturers Association, and Dennis Bringuet, the owner of Ace Sign Company in Springfield, about the loss of manufacturing jobs in Illinois, as well as the lack of workers to fill those jobs. This runs about 25 minutes.
Greg Bays and Dennis Bringuet, thank you for joining us on the Illinois Channel. We wanted to talk, one of the main issues that we often hear being discussed is this whole discussion about workers' compensation and what we need to do to change the business climate in Illinois. The governor's often raised these issues, and we thought it would be very instructive for our viewers to be able to hear from both you, Greg, as the head of the manufacturers, and from someone who is a manufacturer. So thanks for joining us. Greg, let me start with you, just from the big picture standpoint. How is Illinois to do business in? What are you hearing from your members around the state as far as what they need changed, and why do we hear so much about workers' comp?
Well, we are talking about, and on sort of a statewide tour right now, reminding people and pointing out that Illinois has lost over 300,000 manufacturing jobs since the turn of the century. And really since the end of the 08-09 recession, many of our Midwestern neighbors have been doing better than us in bringing those jobs back. In fact, Michigan, 171,000 net jobs. Indiana, 83,000 net jobs. Illinois in that same time period is essentially flat and not increasing the number of manufacturing jobs at all. Now, is there a great difference between Michigan, Ohio, even our neighboring states, Kentucky or Iowa? I don't think so. I think that we have to be looking inward. There's a systemic problem here, and one of the reasons that we hear most often of why jobs are not coming to this state is workers' compensation. It's cost to business owners. Manufacturers have an ability to possibly move to places that are less expensive. A company like Ace Sign, it's been a long-term business here in Springfield, doesn't have that luxury to just up and move because they've got a base established here. But the kind of cost and the kind of competition that a company like this faces, a lot of times workers' comp is a difference in that area. Why is Illinois bad in that area or whatever? We're the 7th highest in the nation. There's 2 areas of workers' comp that people need to remember and understand. There's the medical side. An employee is injured in the workplace and needs to go to the hospital, whatever. Workers' compensation is charged in the medical world at a higher rate than it is if you happen to have an injury at your home. Example, if you happen to have a rotator cuff surgery, a surgeon and Medicare situation or a regular health care situation would charge maybe $2,500 to $3,000 for that surgery that would take place on somebody's wrist. In the workers' comp area, that might be as much as $8,000 for that same procedure. And we've allowed that to occur and allowed that to grow, and therefore that drives the cost up. The other side is that if you happen to lose the use of a body part, an arm, let's say, is injured, the calculation for the loss of that is based on the number of weeks that is calculated there, and there's a value put on it. So, for example, the use of my right arm, if I've lost that, in Illinois might be as high as $450,000. Average cost across the country, $165,000. 2.5 times that gap. Why has that occurred? And that's one of the reasons we're out sort of sounding the clarion call. We've got to make some changes in some very important areas if we're going to keep jobs in this state.
Before I go to Dennis, why has that occurred, do we know? And what would you say, you've heard all the criticisms before. Some people would say, you're not concerned about the little guy who's working hard on the job, and you're going to throw them out just to cut costs.
It's not true. Owners like Dennis are very concerned about their employees. If there's an injury occur, they want them, one, to get the best medical care possible, and they want to get them back to work as soon as possible. Because the investment in an employee to be involved in running the kind of machines that we see in a facility like this, you just don't find employees who can do that well. So you want to make sure that occurs. The idea, however, is how come that the medical community is allowed to charge that much as a higher rate, and why do union leaders, not so much union members themselves, keep pushing and pushing, thinking that there's an endless pot of money that business owners have to be able to pay workers' comp premiums or self-insured area. Why has it occurred? Well, the political situation in this state has allowed it to occur over a time period, I think, a long time period of getting there. And that's why we think some changes, and why we agree with Governor Rauner in calling for work comp changes in trying to turn around Illinois' problems.
And Dennis, let's talk about you. You're in many ways representative of what we would want to have happen to businesses in Illinois. In other words, as I understand it, this business started under your grandfather. He was probably like a solo worker, but bit by bit, he added new clients. He had enough work. He had to get some help, and he hired people. Today, here you are in a really nice new facility. I mean, it's an older building that's been completely transformed. So I'm sure on one hand you've added to the tax value of this building. How many people do you have working here with A Sign Company?
We currently have 49. And we moved here 4 years ago. We had 21.
So more than doubled in 4 years.
Correct. Yes.
You and I had talked a little bit. One of the challenges facing you, aside from workers' comp and these kind of issues, is just the issue of skilled labor and finding good people to hire.
Absolutely, absolutely. There seems to be a little bit of lacking of schools that people can go to learn certain trades, electrical skills, sheet metal, welding, those types of things. Lincoln Land Community College has done a great job with their career center. We need more of that, or even in the high school level, perhaps some more. Used to be shop classes that I don't think are quite as prevalent these days. But it is difficult to find good skilled labor. A lot of folks get out of college with a $100,000 debt and no job, and they may not have the skills that they need to do the types of things that our business and many other businesses, I hear the same thing. That so we would be in favor of doing whatever we could to facilitate or help bring in more vocational type of schools.
I think some of the countries like Germany have a specific program to develop some of the trades, and we hear that somewhat in the legislature. When you go looking to do a hire, approximately, how many people do you have to interview before you find the right person?
I would say on an average of probably 10 or 12.
And to the extent that it's that difficult to find someone who has the skills and as expensive and time-consuming as it is to hire someone, I guess that would go to the point that you're not looking to have that person injured on the job and be unable to be productive.
Well, that's true, and also another factor is I'm not that familiar with the laws, but there is a causation situation to where I believe if 51% of the injury is caused at work, we should be responsible. But that's not the way it is now. The problem is they could be hurt at their swimming pool at home and claim a hurt shoulder or whatever, and we all pay for it.
How have your insurance rates, work comp insurance rates, changed over the years?
They've gone up significantly, yeah. And we've had really good records. But if you have, for every injury you have, no matter how small it is, your rates are going to go up.
And when you have to put that money out, we see it with the state. The state puts more and more money out for pensions. They don't have the money for other things. Right. When your costs go up for work comp, what kind of belt tightening or changes have you had to make that otherwise you might have made in the business?
Well, our business is a lot like most businesses. Our budgets need to be balanced. And you know, it's difficult to do when all those rates are going up constantly. So we have to make some very tough decisions on whether we can afford to hire or whether we sub out work to other places out of state. Sometimes very easy just to have someone else out of state do some of that work. And of course, that means that our local people aren't getting that work.
Have there been positions that you wanted to fill, but because of the costs increasing that you haven't hired people?
Yes. Well, and finding people is still the largest problem. Yes.
Greg, Dennis brought up the causation, and that's a big issue. What in this discussion of workers' comp, explain to us why that matters.
Well, Illinois has really a almost zero or just almost 1% cause in the workplace makes the business owner responsible for that injury. And so a lot of soft tissue issues, as an example, lower back, neck injuries, things of that nature that may have been caused from a car accident, might have been caused in an old football injury of some sort like that, but gets aggravated in the workplace, the responsibility goes to that particular employer. We also have the situation to where the Work Comp Commission will look at things and they'll say, yeah, there could be, but it hardly ever, especially if it goes on into the court system, is ever shared with any kind of responsibility. Our answer to that is that we think that has to be looked in total. I think it'll be very difficult to pass in the legislature a total 51% cause or whatever. So we need to tighten that area, but we also need to look, as I said earlier, medical cost and the indemnity side of this. The system costs about $3 billion a year. That's in insurance premiums paid out or self-insured insurers or companies that have to take responsibility for. And you know, there's a lot of people feeding off that system. The lawyers on both sides, the medical professionals, whether it's orthopedic surgeons to chiropractors to physical therapy on that side of it. And they fight like crazy to any kind of reforms or any kind of balancing of the work comp cost to other states. And that's what is just very maddening to business owners and organizations like ours that represent companies like this, and saying, folks, 300,000 jobs, if you put all those people since the turn of the century in one place, you'd have Illinois' second largest city. Don't we understand what that means to our state's economy? Don't we understand about those families and manufacturing is usually 1.5 to 2 jobs are created for every manufacturing job is created. And we've got flat growth in this state. We really need to get this cause out there more, and we need to make sure, whether you're Republican or Democrat, that you say this is an area we ought to work together and solve this problem.
You had mentioned in a speech recently at the City Club of Chicago that I think even Idaho created more manufacturing jobs than Illinois did. I think they were 9,000. Ours is 4,000.
4,000, and as I said, our last month, the number came out that those actually 4,000 jobs disappeared in the manufacturing sector in the last month. And no cry of alarm, no saying, what are we going to do here, folks? I mean, Springfield is an example of this. There used to be a vibrant manufacturing sector in this town. Those have all gone away. And look at what the hole that's created in some of the neighborhoods in the city of Springfield. The violence that's going on in Chicago. Where's it happening? It's happening in areas where manufacturing used to be very prevalent in that area. But in Chicago, Cook County, they've got tax policies that are literally driving businesses out of that county and looking for, if they're staying in Illinois, elsewhere in the region, or looking out of state.
I know, Dennis, I mean, from running a business back in the 1980s, it's not just your job, but you're buying materials from any number of other suppliers to your business, right?
Absolutely, we sure are.
What kind of things would you be buying, and are you buying those in Illinois or from out of state?
Well, we try to buy most of it in Illinois. Unfortunately, we're finding that more and more of them are out of state. But we buy a lot of raw aluminum and steel, plastics, inks, paint, products that we use quite a bit of.
And what he just said there, Terry, is the thing about Illinois manufacturing. We are across the spectrum in various products. I mentioned steel, we're a big steel processing state. Plastics in the chemical industry, a big area in that regard. The whole paints and all of that kind of area are made in this state, and we still are very competitive, mainly because our workforce in this state is a good and trainable workforce. But the problem is, too many of them beginning to look like me and Dennis in the fact as we move along in the baby boom bubble are retiring. So the need for the kind of vocational education aspects and certification of people being able to do a job is even more and more needed in this state. So when we have vacancies in the manufacturing arena and can't fill them because of that, that even should drive us even more crazy, because we can solve that problem.
And we're finding that we need to do more and more training in-house, and that's very expensive when you bring someone in who has basically a very low skill level and we have to train them. It can take a lot of time and resources and money to do that. And then, of course, you always run the risk of that person perhaps not sticking around, and so it's a loss.
And all that time and training, it goes out the door.
Right, right. So we would much rather support community colleges or universities that recognize that and could help in that regard.
Greg, when we look at the other states that you say, and they're growing in the same national economy that Illinois is in, what are they doing right that we're not doing?
Well, for example, we have various tax credits that are at the moment expired. Research and development tax credit. We are a state that, I was talking earlier about the sectors, pharmaceutical manufacturing as an example. Number of jobs in the northern part of the state directly involved in them. The research and development of what those companies are doing are their lifeblood. They're not looking at the product that they're selling today. They're already developing the replacements for that 5, 6, 10 years down the road. We as a state like this don't have a credit, a tax credit. Those other states do for that kind of activity. Just crazy that we don't have it. Manufacturers purchase credit are another example. Items that are purchased that are not directly related in the process of manufacturing, you get a credit in sales tax for those kinds of things. It's a headache for companies like ACE to be able to keep up with all that paperwork. We should streamline it and make it easier, and those states do that kind of thing as well. Those states also have their fiscal house in order. Illinois does not. Dennis and I were talking before we went on air about they do business with the state. They have to wait for their payment from the state like other vendors lined up for that. Essentially, state government is financing its activities on the back of small businesses like ACE. That's just wrong.
And our employees and our vendors don't wait. We pay them every week.
And you pay your taxes on time.
The taxes are paid on time. That's right. Yeah, it's a challenge.